The wind came hard across the Montana flats that night. Cold enough to sting the lungs, cold enough to make the wooden porch groan softly beneath Eleanor Hale's boots as she stood beneath the weak yellow glow of the oil lamp hanging beside her front door. The lamp swayed in the wind, back and forth, back and forth. She should have gone inside an hour ago. The fire in the stove was dying. The soup pot had already gone cold. Caleb had fallen asleep at the table with his cheek pressed against folded arms, still wearing his coat because the house never seemed warm enough anymore. But Eleanor stayed outside, one hand wrapped around her own elbow, the other holding the edge of the porch railing, watching the road, not because she expected company. Nobody visited the Hale farm anymore, not after Thomas died. The town had changed toward her slowly at first, like winter moving over fields, quiet, gradual. Then all at once, at church, conversations lowered when she walked past. At the general store, men who once laughed with her husband suddenly spoke carefully around her, like grief might spread if they stood too close. And after the debts started piling up, pity became something worse. People looked at her the way they looked at a barn with a broken roof. Too expensive to save. The lamp flickered again. Eleanor glanced back through the window behind her. Caleb was still asleep at the table, 8 years old, too thin lately. The sight of him sitting there, with one small hand still curled around a spoon, made something tighten quietly inside her chest. She looked away before it stayed too long. Inside the kitchen, there was half a loaf of bread wrapped beneath cloth, one potato, a little flour, coffee grounds she had already used twice. That was all. Earlier that afternoon, she had gone into town hoping Mr. Talbert might let her buy supplies on credit one more time. But the old shopkeeper would not meet her eyes. Can't do it anymore. Eleanor, he had spoken gently, which somehow made it worse. She remembered standing there, while two ranch hands near the stove pretended not to listen. One of them finally muttered, "That farm's dying anyway," and nobody corrected him. The porch boards creaked beneath her feet as she shifted against the cold. Far out beyond the fence line, darkness rolled across the open land in waves. The moon kept disappearing behind thick clouds. Snow left over from last week still covered patches of ground beneath the dead grass. Everything looked tired. The farm, the fences, the widow standing beneath the porch light. Even the horses in the stable had stopped making much noise at night. Eleanor finally stepped back toward the door. Enough. The oil in the lamp needed saving. She reached for the chain hanging beside it, then stopped. Something stood near the road, very still. At first, she thought it might be part of the fence post shadow, but then the shape moved slightly. A horse, and beside it, a man, too far away to see clearly. He wasn't approaching, wasn't calling out, just standing there in the dark, while the wind pushed hard across the field between them. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. Most travelers passed through the main road miles south of here. Nobody came this direction unless they were lost or desperate. The stranger finally began walking toward the house slowly, leading the horse beside him. No sudden movements, no drunken sway, just steady footsteps through frozen mud. Eleanor did not go inside. One hand slipped quietly beneath her shawl, where a small revolver rested at her waist. The man stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Up close, he looked older than she first thought. Mid-30s maybe. Heavy coat coated with trail dust. Dark stubble along his jaw. One glove missing. His horse looked nearly as exhausted as he did. The stranger removed his hat. "Sorry to bother you." "Ma'am." His voice was rough from cold. "I saw the light." Eleanor studied him carefully. He did not smell like whiskey. Did not stare too long. Did not smile too quickly. That mattered. Traveling through these territories alone had taught her that decent men often announce themselves quietly. The stranger glanced toward the stable, just wondering if there's water for the horse. Nothing else. No request to come inside. No performance about hard luck. No pity directed at her house. Only the horse. Eleanor looked at the animal first. Its ribs showed faintly beneath the hide. The poor thing trembled against the wind. Then she noticed the man's hands, raw, cracked, nearly purple from cold. Something in her expression softened before she meant for it to. "You look cold," she said quietly. The man blinked once, as if nobody had spoken to him kindly in some time. Maybe nobody had. He looked away for a moment toward the hanging porch light, moving gently above them. "I've been colder." Eleanor nodded once toward the stable. "There's water in the back trough if it hasn't frozen over." "Thank you, ma'am." He led the horse away without another word. Eleanor stayed on the porch, watching him disappear into the darkness behind the barn. She should have locked the door after that. Instead, she went inside and quietly added another piece of wood to the stove. The kitchen smelled faintly of onions and smoke. Caleb stirred at the table. "Mama, go back to sleep." "Sweetheart." "Who was outside?" "Just a traveler." The boy rubbed his eyes. "Is he staying?" Eleanor hesitated. "Just tonight, maybe." Caleb looked towards the window, where the porch light glowed softly against the dark glass. Then he rested his head back down. The room fell quiet again. Eleanor stood beside the stove for a long moment. Then, without really thinking about it, she opened the cupboard and took down another bowl. She filled it with the last of the soup. Not much, but warm. Outside, the wind kept blowing. She carried the bowl across the yard herself. The stable smelled of hay and cold leather. The stranger was brushing down the horse slowly beneath lantern light. He turned when she entered. Eleanor held out the bowl. "You'll need something warm if you plan on sleeping out here." For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face, like he did not quite know what to do with kindness. "You don't have to do that." "I know." He accepted the bowl carefully with both hands. Steam curled upward between them. "Thank you." She nodded once and turned to leave. "Ma'am." Eleanor looked back. The stranger glanced toward the horse. "Her name's June." Eleanor looked at the old mare. "Pretty thing." He gave the faintest smile. "Used to be faster." Then the smile disappeared again. Eleanor left him there, beneath the lantern glow, and returned to the house. But before going upstairs that night, she checked the porch lamp once more and left it burning. Morning arrived gray and bitter cold. Eleanor woke before sunrise as always. The stove had nearly gone out again. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stepped quietly past Caleb's room before heading outside with the water buckets. The air cut sharp against her lungs. Then she stopped. The buckets were already full. She stared at them beside the porch steps. Fresh water, no ice. For a moment, she simply stood there confused. Then she noticed footprints in the snow leading toward the stable. The stranger. Eleanor looked toward the barn. Smoke drifted lightly from inside. She carried the buckets in anyway. An hour later, she found him repairing the broken stable door without being asked. The lower hinge had sagged for nearly 2 months. Thomas used to handle those things before sickness hollowed him down to skin and coughing fits. Eleanor had tried repairing it herself once. The wood nearly fell on her shoulder. Now the stranger worked quietly with steady hands, despite the cold. Caleb stood nearby, watching him closely from a safe distance. The man looked up when Eleanor approached. Door was catching against the frame. "I noticed." Eleanor crossed her arms against the morning wind. "You don't have to work for water." The stranger tightened one last bolt. "I know." "Same answer as last night." He stepped back from the door. "Swings better now." Caleb moved closer to inspect the hinge. "How'd you fix that?" The man crouched beside him. Pressure was wrong here. He tapped the warped wood gently. Wood swells in winter. The boy nodded seriously, like this was important knowledge. Eleanor watched them silently. Children knew things adults ignored. Caleb had barely spoken to another man since Thomas died. Now he stood beside this stranger without fear. "What's your name?" Caleb finally asked. "Samuel." "That all." "Samuel Reed." Caleb looked satisfied with that. Eleanor wasn't. "Where you headed?" "Mr. Reed." Samuel stood slowly. "Wyoming eventually." Eventually. The word hung there, meaning nowhere immediate, meaning no home waiting. Eleanor glanced toward June in the stable. "You can stay another night if the storm comes back." Samuel nodded once. Appreciated. No smile, no charm, just gratitude spoken plainly. By evening, the clouds had thickened again. Wind rattled the windows hard enough to wake the house. Eleanor stirred stew quietly over the stove, while Caleb colored beside the table. The front door opened softly. Samuel stepped in only far enough to leave chopped firewood near the wall. Snow dusted his shoulders. "You can leave it there," Eleanor said. He nodded, then moved to leave again. "Supper's hot." Samuel paused. The room stayed quiet. Caleb looked between them. Eleanor kept stirring the pot. "You don't have to stand in the barn all night." Another pause. Then Samuel removed his hat and stepped farther inside. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, with another adult in it. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Eleanor placed a bowl in front of him. Steam rose between them. Samuel sat carefully at the edge of the chair, like a man unused to staying long anywhere. Caleb watched him openly. Samuel ate slowly, respectfully, not starving himself against pride, not swallowing food like an animal either, just careful. The storm worsened outside. Wind pressed snow against the windows. For the first time in months, another pair of boots rested near Eleanor's stove, and strangely enough, the house felt warmer for it. After supper, Samuel repaired the loose leg beneath Caleb's chair, while the boy sat beside him asking questions about horses. You ever been to Texas? Once. What's it like? Hot. Caleb grinned. That all? Mostly. Eleanor looked down to hide the faint smile pulling at her mouth. Later that night, Caleb fell asleep beside the stove, while Samuel still worked quietly on the chair. Eleanor approached carefully. You don't have to keep fixing things. Samuel tightened the final screw. Habit, I guess. He stood. Most places I stay long enough and usually need fixing. The sentence landed softly between them. Eleanor studied him a moment. Not the words, the tiredness behind them. She handed him a blanket. There's room near the stove tonight. Samuel looked genuinely surprised. I don't want to impose. You're not. Another silence. Then he accepted the blanket. Thank you, Eleanor. It was the first time he had said her name. Outside, snow covered the fields quietly beneath the dark. Inside, the porch light still glowed through the kitchen window, and for the first time since Thomas died, Eleanor did not feel entirely alone listening to the wind. By the third week, Samuel Reed no longer looked like a traveler passing through. His coat still hung beside the door every evening. His boots still carried trail dust into the kitchen, but the house had begun making room for him in small ways. Nobody talked about aloud. A second coffee cup stayed near the stove now. Caleb stopped asking whether Samuel would still be there in the morning, and Eleanor no longer startled at the sound of another pair of footsteps outside. Before sunrise, the farm itself seemed to breathe differently. Fences stood straighter. The stable door no longer groaned in the wind. Wood stayed stacked neatly beside the porch before storms arrived. Quiet things, the kind that changed a home slowly. One evening, Samuel repaired the old rocking chair that had belonged to Thomas. The chair had sat untouched near the corner of the living room for nearly a year. One runner bent unevenly from years of use. Eleanor had stopped seeing it after a while. Grief did that sometimes. It turned objects invisible because looking hurt too much. She stepped into the room carrying folded laundry and stopped when she saw Samuel kneeling beside the chair with tools spread across the floor. For a moment, something defensive rose inside her chest. Not anger, just fear, as though touching the chair might somehow disturb what little remained of her husband. Samuel sensed her standing there. If you'd rather I leave it alone. No. Her voice came softer than expected. It's all right. Samuel nodded once and returned to work. The room stayed quiet, except for the small sounds of wood and metal. Eleanor watched him a while longer. He never asked questions about Thomas, never tried forcing comfort into places it did not belong. That mattered more than she could explain. Most people in town either avoided mentioning her husband completely or spoke about him with the careful pity reserved for funerals. Samuel simply respected the empty spaces Thomas had left behind. That night, the repaired chair sat beside the stove again. Not perfect, still worn, still old, but steady. Caleb climbed into it immediately, with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Samuel leaned back against the wall afterward, drinking coffee quietly, while Eleanor washed dishes. The fire cracked softly behind them. Outside, snowmelt dripped from the roof. Then Caleb looked sleepily toward Samuel. You staying tomorrow? Samuel glanced toward Eleanor before answering. If your mother doesn't mind. Caleb nodded. Like that settled everything. Good. Then he fell asleep in the rocking chair beneath the firelight. Eleanor stood still for a long moment with one wet plate in her hands. Good. Such a small word. Yet it filled the room more completely than conversation ever could. A few days later, rain came hard across the valley. Cold spring rain, the kind that turned roads into rivers of mud and trapped people indoors with their thoughts. Samuel spent most of the afternoon repairing harness straps near the porch, while Eleanor kneaded bread dough beside the kitchen window. Caleb colored pictures at the table. Nobody spoke much, but silence had changed inside the Hale house. It no longer felt heavy. Rain hammered softly against the roof. The smell of fresh bread slowly filled the room. Samuel finally glanced toward the oven. Smells better than anything I've had in months. Eleanor brushed flour from her hands. That bad out there? Samuel looked down at the leather strap between his fingers. Some places don't bother keeping ovens warm. The sentence settled quietly between them. Eleanor studied him for a moment. Not pushing, not prying, just listening. She realized then how little Samuel spoke about himself. No stories, no complaints, no grand explanations about where he came from. Only pieces, like a man who had spent too long learning not to take up space. That evening, the rain finally eased. Mist rolled low across the fields outside. While the sky darkened blue beyond the porch, Samuel sat near the steps, repairing a saddle strap beneath the porch light. Eleanor stepped outside carrying a folded blanket. "You'll freeze out here." Samuel looked up. "I've slept in worse places." She handed him the blanket anyway. The porch light moved gently above them in the wind. For a while neither spoke. The fields stretched dark and endless beyond the fence line. Then Samuel finally asked, "Why do you keep that lamp burning all night?" Eleanor looked toward the warm glow beside the door. "Thomas used to haul freight through the mountains sometimes. Long trips, dangerous weather." She folded her arms against the cold. "He always said the worst feeling in the world was riding home through darkness, wondering if anyone left a light on for you." Samuel listened quietly. "After he died, I just kept doing it." Her voice almost disappeared beneath the wind. "Guess I forgot to stop." Samuel looked towards the fields for a long time before answering. "I think some people need a light even after they're gone." Eleanor turned toward him slowly, not because of the words, because of how gently he said them. No performance, no attempt to sound wise, just understanding. The kind born from carrying loneliness too long yourself. Neither spoke again after that. But when Eleanor went inside later that night, she noticed Samuel remained beneath the porch light a while longer than usual, like he had nowhere else in the world he wanted to be. The sickness came 2 weeks later. Caleb woke before dawn, burning with fever. Eleanor knew immediately something was wrong. The boy could barely keep his eyes open. His breathing sounded shallow, uneven. Panic moved cold through her stomach. The nearest doctor was nearly 12 miles away. And yesterday's rain had destroyed half the road into town. Samuel was already pulling on his coat before she even asked. "I'll bring him back." "Samuel, I know the roads." He was saddling June before sunrise fully broke over the fields. Cold wind tore across the yard, while Eleanor stood on the porch, holding Caleb wrapped in blankets near the doorway. Samuel tightened the saddle straps quickly, then looked toward her. "Keep the fire going." That was all. Then he rode hard into the storm. The day stretched endlessly after that. Rain returned, gray, relentless. Caleb drifted in and out of sleep beside the stove, while Eleanor changed cold cloths against his forehead. Every sound outside made her heart jump. Every minute felt longer than the last. By nightfall, she began imagining the worst. Roads washed out, horse injured, Samuel never returning, because people always left eventually. That was how life worked. The fire had nearly burned low when hoofbeats finally thundered across the yard. Eleanor opened the door before the horse fully stopped. Samuel climbed down slowly beside an older doctor, wrapped in heavy coats. Both men were soaked through completely. Samuel's lips had turned pale blue from cold, but the medicine was there. The doctor worked through most of the night, while Samuel sat silently near the wall, dripping rainwater onto the floorboards. Only after Caleb's fever finally began breaking near dawn did Eleanor notice Samuel's hands shaking from exhaustion. The doctor left shortly after sunrise. "Roads will be worse by afternoon," he warned. Samuel walked him back outside without complaint. When he returned, he moved toward the chair near the stove and sat heavily for the first time since arriving at the farm. Eleanor watched him quietly. His eyes closed almost immediately. He had fallen asleep sitting upright. The room stayed still except for the fire. Eleanor looked down at the blanket folded beside Caleb's bed, then slowly crossed the room. Carefully, so carefully, she draped it over Samuel's shoulders. He stirred slightly, but did not wake. For a moment, her hand remained resting lightly against the blanket near his shoulder, not touching him directly, just staying there, because nobody had ridden through freezing rain for her family in a very long time. Later that afternoon, Caleb woke weak but smiling faintly. Sam came back. Eleanor nodded. "Yeah." The boy looked toward Samuel asleep by the fire. Knew he would. Eleanor glanced toward the man beneath the blanket. The strange thing was, she had known too after Caleb recovered. Something shifted quietly inside the house. Not dramatic, nothing spoken aloud, but temporary no longer fit around Samuel Reed the way it once had. One evening, Eleanor found him repairing the old windmill behind the barn, while the sunset burned gold across the fields. That thing's been broken nearly a year, she called out. Samuel tightened one final bolt. Not anymore. The old blade slowly turned against the evening wind, for the first time since Thomas died. Creaking softly, steady, Eleanor stared at it longer than she meant to. Thomas built that with his father. Samuel stepped down from the ladder, figured it shouldn't stay broken. The sentence hit her harder than expected, because that was what Samuel kept doing, not replacing the past, respecting it enough to repair what grief had abandoned. That night after supper, Eleanor opened the drawer near the kitchen counter and removed a small iron key. Samuel looked up from his coffee. "What's that?" "Key to the storage shed. You'll need it if you're fixing half this farm." Samuel stared at the key in her palm, then at her. "You sure?" Eleanor nodded once. The room stayed warm and quiet around them. Finally, Samuel reached out and accepted it carefully, like it meant more than metal. And maybe it did, because it was the first thing Eleanor had willingly handed someone since burying her husband. Outside, the porch light glowed softly into the darkness, and for the first time in nearly a year, it no longer looked lonely. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories.